안녕하십니까. 한국언론진흥재단
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
지금부터
I am Kim Ji-hyuk from News Media Support Team of the Korea Press Foundation. Now I'd like to announce the official start of the 4th EWC-KPF Forum, co-hosted by the East-West Center and the Korea Press Foundation, under the theme of climate change and the role of news media. This event is held in conjunction to the 2021 P4G Seoul Summit. The forum is a virtual event with speakers connecting in from Korea, the US, Indonesia, and Singapore.
토론회는 한국언론진흥재단과 아이랑 TV 유튜브 채널을 통해서 한국어와
The forum
생중계되고 있습니다.
will be live streamed on YouTube and Arirang TV in English and Korean. The participants at the Seoul venue are wearing their face masks to comply with the quarantine measures. I'd like to invite Mr. Pyo Wan-soo, the chairman of the KPF, for his opening remarks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Pyo Wan-soo, chairman of the Korea Press Foundation. I would like to thank our co-hosts, the East-West Center, and its head, Richard Bolstake. And I would like to also extend my gratitude to Ambassador Yonsei for his congratulatory remarks. Let me also thank Kelly Sims Gallagher, Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and Professor Lee Tae-dong at the Department of Political Science and International Studies at Yonsei University for your presentations. My thanks also go to journalists participating as panelists, journalists that are representing Korea, US, Singapore, and Indonesia. And I would like to also thank those of you currently joining us live via the internet. The P4 Seoul Summit meeting is being held today and on the 30th for 2 days at the Republic of Korea. It brings together governments, corporations, and the civil societies in order to tackle the issue of climate change. On the occasion of the first 2021 P4G Seoul Summit meeting, today's discussion session or today's forum will also deal with the topic of climate change and the role of news media, and our forum will be held twice, in the morning and in the afternoon. I hope to see meaningful discussions take place about what the role of news media and journalists should be in the face of a truly global crisis called climate change. I would like to once again thank all of the participants here at the conference room and those of you joining us live through YouTube. The Korea Press Foundation will continue to create forums such as these for discussing integral societal issues. Thank you very much.
네, 다음으로 미국 동서센터 리처드
Next.
볼스테케 센터장께서 인사 말씀 하시겠습니다.
I'd like to invite the director of the East-West Center.
Aloha and welcome to this forum on climate change and the role of news media, co-sponsored by the Korea Press Foundation and the East-West Center. I'm very sorry I can't address you live, but I have a conflict that I can't get out of, but I would not pass this chance to say a few words to this group as you start another action in this forum series. I want to give a special thanks to the forum, to the Korea Press Foundation, its very able staff, for working so well with my center colleagues to make this series of forum webinars so successful. Thanks as well to the distinguished scholars and journalists who are participating in today's event. This is the fourth forum in this series, which started actually last year in April during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Each forum has addressed important regional concerns and has attracted broad audiences. Today's topic is on climate change, and I would like to highlight some of the East-West Center's work in this area. In the Center's research department, our Pacific RISA team, funded by NOAA grants, does outstanding actionable research on climate-related issues. RISA stands for Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, and the work of this group is indeed integrated across scientific disciplines and various institutions. The team works with federal, state, and local partners to synthesize climate information and coordinate assessments for the U.S.-affiliated Pacific Islands region. So far, RISA team has produced 3 Pacific Islands regional climate assessments. These reports are available on our East West Center website, and 3 more reports are planned in the near future. The East West Center is also hosting a series of webinars called East West Center Insights, Asia-Pacific Environmental Transitions. Just yesterday, a researcher in our Pacific RISA team presented insights on charting new pathways through climate crisis. Please keep an eye out for more EWC insights in the coming months. All of our climate-related work follows the usual East-West Center approach of promoting constructive collaboration among nations, communities, and practitioners with the goal of meeting the broad spectrum of socioeconomic, environmental, and political challenges that come from climate change. We appreciate at the East West Center your attendance today, and we also appreciate our ongoing partnership with the Korea Press Foundation. We both are trying to seek and find better cooperation, better understanding, and better action from the challenges of climate change and the whole spectrum of activities that surround those challenges in a constructive way. Thank you for your time and your effort for attending today. Mahalo.
네, 다음으로 P4G 정상회의 준비 기획단장인 유현철 외교부
Next, I'd like to invite Mr. Yu Yeon-chul, who is currently serving as Executive Director of the 2021 P4G Seoul Summit Preparatory Office.
Chairperson of Korea Press Foundation Pyo Wan-soo, President of East West Center Richard Brustek, distinguished speakers and guests. I'd like to begin by extending my sincere gratitude to the Korean Press Foundation and the East West Center for making this forum possible on the occasion of 2021 P4G Seoul Summit under the theme of climate change and the role of news media, which is one of the most pertinent topics of the era. As Korean, the ambassador for climate change, it is my great pleasure to see so many prestigious journalists and the experts meet together at this meaningful event to discuss what media could contribute to support climate actions. In line with the continuous global efforts of achieving net zero and the global goals 2030, P4G Seoul Summit will be the first multilateral summit on the environment hosted by the Republic of Korea. P4G, the short for Partnering Green Growth and the Global Goals 2030, is a global multilateral platform to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. P4G aims to accelerate innovative partnerships between public and private sectors, focusing on 5 core areas closely connected to SDGs, which are food and agriculture, water, energy, cities, and circular economy, to effectively respond to climate change. The main theme of the P4G Seoul Summit is inclusive green recovery towards carbon neutrality, as the world is facing the unprecedented crisis of COVID-19, economic recession, and climate change. The summit will be an open platform to bring various stakeholders, including the governments, businesses, and civil society, all together to share their vision to build back better and greener. If you allow me to characterize the next 10 years, then I'd like to describe it as a decade of digitalization and decarbonization. And 2021 is the kickoff year for the international community to embark on the implementation of the Paris Agreement, SDGs, and 2050 carbon neutrality. This adds more significance to the P4G Seoul Summit to be held from May 30th to 31st in 2021. At such a critical juncture, we start new decades of climate action, news media plays a catalytic role to raise public awareness and encourage everyone to take swift climate action. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to cordially invite you all to the upcoming 2021 P4G Seoul Summit. Furthermore, it will be highly appreciated if you all would join our strenuous efforts to promote P4G Seoul Summit so that we could gain more gravity to inspire the international community to continue its firm climate actions. I'd like to close my remarks by introducing the slogan of the P4G Seoul Summit, Green we go, change we make. Thank you so much.
자, 그럼 본격적으로 토론회를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘
We'll now start the
김재원
presentation.
를 소개합니다.
The MC for the forum is a meteorologist and reporter Kim Se-hyun of JTBC.
연세대에서 대기과학 연구로
She received her PhD in atmospheric science from Yonsei University. Now I will hand the floor to reporter Kim.
네, 안녕하세요. 방금 소개받은 김세현입니다. 오늘
Thank you for the kind introduction. For today's forum, we have 2 presenters from the US and Korea and 6 panelists from the US, Korea, Singapore, and Indonesia. Our presenter from Korea is Dr. Lee Tae-dong, Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Yonsei University. He's also serving as the Director of Environment, Energy, and Human Resource Development Center of the same university. His PhD explored the topic of global cities and climate change from the University of Washington, USA. We also have Dr. Kelly Sims Gallagher, the Dean of the Fletcher School, Tufts University. She served in the second term of Obama administration as a senior policy advisor in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Currently, she is a member of the board of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. For our panel discussion, Dr. Kang Chansu, environmental journalist of JoongAng Daily, will be joining us. He served as the chair of the Korean Environmental Journalists Club and earned his Doctor of Science in Microbial Ecology in Seoul National University. Reporter Lisa Friedman of the New York Times will be joining us for the panel discussion. She is a reporter of the climate desk at the New York Times and covers climate and environmental policies of the U.S. administration, along with the climate-related international conferences. Reporter Choi of Hankyoreh Media will also join us for the panel discussion. She's heading the climate change team of Hankyoreh Media. Reporter Choi investigated animal rights and issues through Animal People Desk of Hankyoreh Media and published a book titled My Sweet Urban Apiary. Sustainability editor Eric Roston of Bloomberg News will be joining the panel discussion as well. For over 15 years, editor Roston investigated and reported on climate change issues and published a book titled The Carbon Age, which has been translated into Korean. Journalist Atikah, Ishmah, Winahyu of Media Indonesia will be joining the panel discussion from Indonesia. She covers humanitarian topics, in particular environmental and health-related issues. Last but not least, we have science and environment correspondent Audrey Tan from the Straits Times. She's also running Green Pulse, an environmental podcast. Correspondent Tan received her master's from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, University of California, San Diego. Now we'll begin our presentation and discussion under the theme of climate change and the role of news media. The allotted time for discussion and the presentation is 90 minutes. I'd like to ask our speakers to be mindful of the time. Now I'd like to invite Professor Lee Tae-dong. Please come up to the stage. Nice to meet you all. My name is Lee Tae-dong from Yonsei University. It's a great honor for me to be presenting on this important topic of climate change and the role of news media. So today I'm going to talk about the media's role in climate change and climate change and media in the US and South Korea. And I will conclude with my suggestions for media for climate change action. So climate change is happening actually, and the cause of it is human economic activity. This has been supported by the decades of research of the global scientific community and the IPCC. Now, this is a very crucial issue and a global issue. However, at the same time, it is a huge challenge for us to effectively tackle. Now, we are all wearing face masks. When it comes to the coronavirus pandemic, we can see the numbers every day, the number of cases, confirmed cases, deaths, and so on. When it comes to find us, we can also see the numbers every day. However, climate change is a long-term process, and the climate doesn't necessarily mean the weather today. And it's difficult for us to actually see its impact on our everyday life. And the largest cause of climate change is human economic activity, including the use of fossil fuels. And this is why climate change is such a difficult challenge to tackle, as it's closely related to our everyday economic activity. That is why the role of news media is so important. The news media can create a platform for a discussion on this complex topic of climate change. And climate change is an area where new scientific discoveries take place. Now, I am in charge of more than 130 pages in a climate report, which contains 17 more such chapters. So from this you can see there is a huge amount of scientific data which should be delivered to the public in a understandable, easily understandable manner. So that's the role of news media. And the media also mediates the different interests of stakeholders. And the media can play the role of criticizing climate change inactions or insufficient policies. Now, climate change is a global phenomenon, but at the same time, it has different impact depending on where you live. So one local area could suffer from flooding by heavy rainfall, and another local area can suffer from severe drought. So the news media has to report on these various expressions of climate change at the same time. And the core role of the news media would be shaping public opinion. So why is this important? As you may well know, in a democratic society, it's important that the citizens recognize the importance of an issue so that the politicians to take actions. So when the public opinion is formed and the politicians take actions, we can actually change the situation. And now, climate change is not about a single industry or a single factory. We need the majority of the people recognizing the importance of the issue and taking actions together. Now, this table shows the amount of articles dealing with climate change in relation to all articles published in the analyzed newspapers per month between 1996 and 2010. Fortunately, with scientific advancements on climate change, we are seeing an increase in the number of coverages. And when there are direct impacts of climate change, such as wildfire, we see a hike. We see hikes in the number of coverages. This chart also shows the ups and downs of the newspaper coverage of climate change or global warming. the peaks in the chart shows very large number of coverages on the occasion of the IPCC formation, the adoption of Kyoto Protocol, and other important events. When it comes to climate change policy, I think the next speaker will elaborate on with much detail, so I'll be rather brief on this. So the United States used to be the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases before China took its place. When it comes to U.S. climate change response, there are a lot of fluctuations in the government's intensity of the government's responses. Trump walked out of the Paris Agreement, but Biden just rejoined. And his administration is being active in pursuing alternatives to fossil fuels and achieve carbon neutrality. And internationally, there is a discussion on carbon tax and border control related to carbon emissions in partnership with the European Union. Now, this chart shows the U.S. newspaper coverage of climate change, and we see a constant rise in coverage. And from this, we can see the importance of the formation of a team dedicated to climate change issues in news media. As I mentioned earlier, climate change is not tangible. So for the public to actually feel the impact of climate change is quite difficult. That's why it is encouraging that the major newspapers are establishing climate teams and actively covering this issue. However, except for a few major newspapers, most of the media haven't been covering climate change issues in detail, including the IPCC report. Now, let's talk about South Korea's climate change response. South Korea has been developing very fast based on fossil fuel-based industries. And that's why the international society has been quite critical on the stance of South Korea. Only recently, the South Korean government announced the Green New Deal policy, investing 37 trillion Korean won in creating green jobs. Now, let's take a look at South Korea's climate change coverage. Now, Hankyoreh, Korea Herald, and a few other newspapers created climate teams recently and actively covering this issue. This chart shows similar patterns with the coverage by U.S. media and global media we saw earlier. But here we do not see a long-term increase, except for some hikes in the number of coverages on the occasions of special events like the conference of parties and summit meetings covering climate change issues. And much of the media has bias against solar panel and renewable energy. So, what can the news media do better? So far, most of the coverage was about what the problem is. But so what? And what should be done were not covered that much. For example, what organizations and companies are doing and can do to combat climate change. We need actual examples of climate actions shared by the media. These stories should be interesting and inspirational at the same time. And we should deal with these actual cases not just in the form of newspaper, but in other forms, including social media. Of course, dealing with climate change is quite difficult because it should be based on scientific knowledge. Some of the journalists here have PhD in climate science at all, and climate science and so on. And you need to learn a lot to have a full understanding of climate science, and and that's why it's more important for the journalists to convey this scientific knowledge to the public in an easily understandable manner. So, it should be covered in an inspirational manner, and what the different actors can do and have to do should be explained in a plain manner as well. And recently, I took a look at the active use of new media covering the issue of climate change, and I felt that it would be actually much more effective than only covering in the form of conventional media. And now, there is a coalition of journalists and media to produce more informed and urgent climate stories, which is called Covering Climate Now. In Korea, there is the Korea Environment Reporters Club, who's playing a similar role. And the club is producing reports and giving awards to important actors in the environmental and climate action area. And when we take a look at the example of the Guardian, the media organizations themselves have to take action against climate change. For example, The Guardian announced that it's going to achieve net zero emissions itself by 2030 and will no longer accept advertisements from fossil fuel firms. And it also decided to alarm the community through recreation of terms. For example, from climate change to climate emergency, from global warming to global heating. And I believe together with the networks of journalists, I believe the news media will be able to play a more active role. So I've used my 15 minutes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for keeping to the time. Thank you, Professor, for your insightful presentation on climate change response and the role of the news media and the way forward. Thank you very much. We will now hear from the United States on U.S. climate policy. Dr. Kelly Sims Gallagher, please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you here from the United States, from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm going to share my screen. And Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. Could someone confirm that you can see the screen? Is it okay?
Kelly, I think we can see it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to attempt to cover kind of a overview and introduction to American climate policy. And I'd like to start by just presenting the targets, which some of you may be familiar with. And I wanted to do this using the historical timeline because this will be helpful to us later in my presentation. So to begin with, the first US target dates back to 1990 when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. And at that time, all industrialized countries, including the United States, aimed to stabilize their greenhouse gas emissions at 1990 levels. In 2012, earlier in 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated, the American target was 7% below 1990 levels by 2012. And then the Copenhagen Accord, which was negotiated in 2009, had President Obama committed to a target in the range of 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. So notice the different baseline, and not 1990 anymore, but 2005. And then the Paris Agreement target for the United States was 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025, with best efforts to achieve 28%. And as you probably know, President Biden recently announced a new target for 2030 of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. And you can see I put X's against these first two targets because the United States did not, in fact, achieve those targets, but it did achieve the Copenhagen target in 2020. And you can see this in the most recent publication of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in their greenhouse gas inventory. Here you can see that U.S. emissions peaked in 2007 and have been modestly but steadily declining ever since. As of 2019, according to these official statistics, the United States is presently 2% above 1990 levels and 13% below 2005 levels. This shows U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by sector. And the important thing to notice on this graph is that you can see most of the declines to date in the United States have come from the electric power sector. And that is largely due to a shift away from coal, as I will show you in just a minute. Here's another depiction. This shows you, this is from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, also showing this pretty sharp decline in energy-related carbon dioxide emissions from the electric power sector to the present. And then this, on the other side of the hyphenated line, you can see their projections going forward. I must say the EIA is notoriously pessimistic in its reference case. But one thing is clear, as you can see on the right-hand side of the graph here, we see a very pronounced decline in coal consumption and greenhouse gas emissions from coal. And this decline is projected to continue by EIA. You can also see in their projections for the future a lot of optimism about the growth of wind and solar between now and 2050. And EIA also projects pretty strong consumption of natural gas. I think this is something that's being hotly debated in the kind of political process in the United States. But again, let me just emphasize this really pronounced decline in coal-related electricity production up until the present day. Here you can also see that the new coal-fired power, or new power plants and retirements of power plants. Everything below zero here represents a retirement of a power plant, and all of the black lines here are retirements of coal-fired power plants, and oil and gas is in orange. So again, you can see we've already had a lot of coal retirements, and we anticipate having many more, including a lot in 2025. And hopefully you can also see that we are already seeing significant growth in wind and solar in terms of new electricity generation capacity. This also shows the second most important greenhouse gas in the United States, which is methane, and the sources of methane emissions. And this is just important more from a political point of view, because many of these sources of methane emissions come from agriculture. And so the farmers will be a political power, and also the oil and gas industry is the second largest source of methane emissions. In this graph, we see, this is kind of a historical graph. This shows you what the Obama administration, I'm gonna pause for just a moment to say, I'm hearing the Korean translation. It's a little bit difficult. Is there a way to turn off the translation for? If not, I'll keep going.
Kelly, it's possible that if you go under interpretation and just do original audio, you might not have the problem.
Okay, I'll just keep going. So what you're seeing here is the Obama administration's projections of how the United States would meet the Paris Agreement target. And there was very detailed modeling of different policies that they would implement in order to achieve the target. I would highlight the importance of the Clean Power Plan and all of these different efficiency standards. And with all of these, the hope was that the United States would hit or come very close to hitting the 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. I want to show you where we are today. The most recent estimate is here. So clearly the United States is not on track to achieve the target that was set by the Obama administration. And that is in large part due to the fact that the Trump administration reversed many of the policies that were put into place or froze the implementation of certain policies, including the Clean Power Plan. It's important to recognize in the United States that state level policies are very important and influential in climate policy. This graph shows how many states have renewable energy portfolio standards and energy efficiency resource standards, and how many have greenhouse gas emissions targets. And you can see a majority of US states already have greenhouse gas emission targets in place. I wanted to mention that the United States, the Biden administration just recently announced a very big commitment to increase overseas climate finance. President Biden announced in April that the United States intends to double by 2024 annual public climate finance to developing countries. And this is going to be roughly equivalent to about a $10 billion commitment, US dollar commitment. So now let me turn to how these policies get made. And of course, we have a formal process and we have an informal process. And I will first talk about the formal process. So of course, we have in the United States an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. And in the legislative process, we have the House and the Senate. And with respect to climate policy, the House of Representatives already passed a climate change bill that was known as the Waxman-Markey bill about 10 years ago now, but it never passed the Senate. And still to this day, we have not passed climate change legislation in the United States, although we have many policies that have been passed that indirectly affect greenhouse gas emissions. The executive branch is very important. Of course, the president is elected for 4 years and allowed 2 terms. And within the president's power is the ability to issue executive orders. These executive orders can be overturned by the legislative branch. President Obama exercised his executive orders frequently in order to create climate change policy. But these executive orders were all overturned by President Trump during his administration. And already we see President Biden again reversing President Trump's executive orders. And the result of this is that the climate policy in the United States has experienced wildly dramatic swings back and forth, depending on who is the president at any given time. The president also has regulatory authorities that have been granted to him or her by an act of Congress. And the Clean Air Act has been one of the most important regulatory authorities that the US president has. So I'm sure you're curious about the new Biden administration and some of the policies that are being contemplated by this new administration. From the very beginning, President Biden elevated 2 officials to cabinet rank, which was the first time this had ever been done. So we now have a presidential level special envoy for climate in John Kerry. And we also have a domestic climate chief, Gina McCarthy, who was formerly the administrator of the EPA under the Obama administration. And this is the first time either of these positions have existed at the presidential level and in the cabinet. I wanted to also mention the Supreme Court, which has made some very important climate change rulings. For example, in 2007, the Supreme Court ruled in a case brought before it by the state of Massachusetts, where I live, that climate change or carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions should be considered a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And this obliged the US EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the informal processes that strongly influence climate policy. And probably the most important thing is the politicization of climate change after what's known as the Republican Revolution of 1994. This was also known as the Gingrich Revolution because Congressman Gingrich was the Speaker of the House at the time. And that was the first time that Republicans came out very strongly opposed to climate policy. Before that time, you may remember that President George Herbert Walker Bush had supported climate change policy, and he, in fact, had submitted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to the US Senate for ratification. But after 1994, in general, it's been fair to say that the Republicans have opposed climate change policy and the Democrats have supported it. You may be well familiar with the presidential election results from 2020. I show you this just to emphasize that the country remains quite divided in terms of the presidential election. In terms of the House of Representatives, you can see how narrowly the Democrats control the House of Representatives, and also how divided the US Senate is, with an even split that is broken only by Vice President Harris and her vote. And this is one reason, this polarization is one reason why it has been so difficult for the federal government to pass a climate change law. So again, I return to the importance of recognizing that policy formation can happen at the federal level and at the state level. And many of the states are implementing much more aggressive climate change policies than the federal government. But we also have some states that have not even begun to create climate change policy in their state. And this is important to recognize because states have very strong powers according to the US Constitution. I want to close by mentioning two other factors. One is interest groups, and the second is the role of the media. Interest groups in US politics are very important. I have provided here 4 examples of influential interest groups. The one on the top left-hand side, the Environmental Defense Fund, is a prominent environmental NGO. The United Mine Workers of America represent the labor movement, and in particular, the coal mining workers, which have had a lot of influence in US policy, particularly influencing the US Senate. The American Farm Bureau Federation is a powerful interest group representing American farmers. And the American Petroleum Institute is also a powerful interest group representing the oil and gas industry. And all of these interest groups have a strong influence on both the legislative branch and the executive branch and elections in the United States. Finally, just a word about the role of the media, but I will strongly defer to Lisa Friedman and Eric Roston, who can talk more about the role of the media in the United States. But I wanted to explain that currently, according to this recent poll from 2020, 65% of Americans believe that the federal government is doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. In other words, they believe federal climate policy should be stronger. But it's very important to realize that there is a big difference between Biden supporters and Trump supporters. Here you can see 68% said that climate change was very important to their vote for the last presidential election, but only 11% of Trump voters believed that was true. And I believe that one reason is because Biden supporters tend to read and consume and watch certain media sources, and Trump supporters consume very different media sources. And so they have very different understanding about the climate change problem. And this has led to public confusion in the United States about the urgency of climate change. And it has also strongly affected US politics, which in turn affect the ability of the federal government to develop, pass, and implement climate change policy. And with that, I will close here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Because we are running out of time, we're going to enter panel discussion right away. We have 6 panelists, so we're going to take turns between the countries. And we're going to let the 2 speakers to answer the questions. So please, mindful of the time. Mr. Kang Chansu of JoongAng Daily, please go ahead first. Thank you very much for inviting me to this meaningful event. I am an environmental journalist in the JoongAng Daily. In our organization, there is no climate team, but we have 3 environmental journalists. In our founding anniversary recently, we had a special coverage of climate and the environment. And thanks to those efforts, we received a lot of awards regarding environmental coverage this year. So I'd like to say that we are making some efforts to do our part. When look at the missions of Korea historically, there was a fast rise in emissions in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. As we are talking about carbon neutrality by 2050, we have to cut emissions very fast, as we have seen the fast growth of emissions in the past. So the carbon neutrality 2050 was already declared, and we have to now discuss how. And for that, we have to envision our future in 2050 in think about what we should do now to achieve that future. So that could be described as the constant discussion between the present and the future. So with the future we want in mind, we have to review the current policies, for example, transport policies, and modify the policies where necessary. And I believe the news media should have a long-term perspective and a wider perspective, and shouldn't be just focused on current issues. In Korea, we see change in government every 5 years. However, carbon neutrality strategy should be based on a long-term perspective with at least 30 years ahead in mind. Now, there is the Presidential Committee on Carbon Neutrality recently established, but the members of the committee only serve for 2 years. So this raises a question of continuity of policies and strategy. So I believe the news media should watch whether the policy continuity is observed. And the news media should also watch corporations. Many people are talking about ESG, the environment, the social responsibility, and governance these days. Of course, the ESG is part of the analysis framework for investors, but ESG reports can be monitored by the news media, and based on the review results, we can demand more cut in the emissions by corporations. And also, we can raise voices like emissions should be reflected more in the ESG criteria. We need to also engage citizens with more and better information about using less plastic products and cutting emissions by individuals. And at the same time, we can contribute to reducing the fatigue in taking actions by citizens. And as I mentioned earlier, the coverage of climate change should be more constant in the charts. Mentioned in the presentations, there are some hikes in the number of coverages only when there are special occasions. And the Korean media doesn't cover that much about what's happening in Korea regarding climate change. So this should also change. So I believe the news media's coverage should take a local perspective. Now, local is a newly coined term, combining global and local. And when it comes to forestation for carbon offset, it might lead to conflicts locally. Although that contributes to tackling this global problem. So I believe we have to be thinking and listening locally in order to contribute to solving this global problem. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next, we would like to invite Lisa Friedman of the New York Times.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I want to first say that I'm an East-West Center alum, so I'm particularly glad to be part of this forum. I thought I would just tell you a little bit about myself and my work and how we handle climate change coverage at the New York Times, which I think is pretty unique and, and I hope a model for other large papers. I feel like I need to say I'm not a science reporter. I worked in local news for years before I came to Washington and covered Congress for a decade before I started writing about climate change. I worked for a publication called Climate Wire in Washington, writing about what climate change means for some of the poorest countries and communities in the world, and covering the UN climate negotiations from Copenhagen through to the Paris Agreement. I came to the New York Times in 2017, and Kelly already did a wonderful job of going through the way that administrations have battered regulations back and forth. The Obama administration, as she laid out, imposed a number of regulations to address climate change, and the Trump administration eliminated virtually all of them. Forgive me, I'm gonna just, there we go. I don't know how this will translate. I used to jokingly describe my job for many years under the Trump administration as writing obituaries for Obama-era climate regulations. That is most of what we did as climate reporters in the Trump era, unfortunately. Writing about the pullout of the Paris Agreement and the elimination of so many regulations and the inability of Congress to act on climate. And now under the Biden administration, things are actually happening. Some journalists, some climate journalists, myself included, worried that there might be less climate coverage under President Biden. One of the kind of strange unintended consequences of Trump's era was that there was an unusually high interest in climate change because we had such a foil in Donald Trump, right? I mean, there were more stories about the pullout of the Paris Agreement, I think, than there were about the signing of the Paris Agreement. I don't have data on that. That's just a gut check from from writing both those stories and having a sense of the interest. But amazingly, there is not just plenty, obviously, to write about. The Biden administration is doing a ton. But I would say interest in climate coverage in the U.S. remains incredibly high. And I'd say I've been really gratified to see the growth of climate coverage in the U.S., even at a time when, newspapers continue to struggle. I'll just describe to you how we do things at the New York Times, because like I said, I do think it's fairly unique. The New York Times works on desks, right? You have the foreign desk, the metro desk, the national desk, and climate change is the first, I want to say only, but I'm not certain about that, but it was the first subject area desk. So what does that mean? That means on a practical level, my stories, and by the way, I should say that I'm part of a 15-person climate change team at the New York Times. That's reporters, editors, multimedia, data visualization. And so because our editor is at the same level as all of these other top editors we don't have to compete to get the attention of an editor. You know, we don't have to compete with an education reporter or a healthcare reporter to get the attention of an editor for a climate change story. Our editors putting climate change stories on the front page every day, along with all of the other big editors at the Times. And at the same time, we work really hard to integrate climate coverage into all parts of the piece. Today, for example, you'll see a story by my colleague, John Stewart, about hurricane forecasts, which are predicted to be predicted to be an above normal season. When hurricane season begins in earnest, members of the climate team will be both in parts of the country that are being hit, will be providing smart information to our colleagues who are covering these extreme weather events on the ground to help our readers understand what influence climate change has in fueling more of these disasters. And we're able, with the number of people that we have, to cover really every facet of climate change, from the international negotiations to what the Biden administration is doing, to what businesses are doing, and really go deep on the science. I'm gonna leave that there. You know, so you have a picture of what I do and what I cover. I'm happy to take any questions that you have about the Biden administration or U.S. coverage of climate policy.
네, 감사합니다. 그럼 한국 측 최우리 한겨레 신문
Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite Choi of Hankyoreh Media.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 한겨레
Good afternoon.
기후변화팀의 팀장을 맡고 있는 최우리입니다.
My name is Choi, the climate change team leader of Hankyoreh Media. Hankyoreh is a liberal newspaper and a daily. The climate change team was established in April 2020 for the first time as a Korean media. And I'd like to share some of my experiences in my organization, as the previous panelist said. I used to cover animal rights, legal issues, and other areas. And I'm talking about this because, like most of the journalists on climate change, these experiences actually help me covering this issue much better. In the last year, the number of coverages of climate change rose sharply. It's because the citizens' awareness improved a lot. The situation of South Korea could be quite different from the United States. Now, the citizens' awareness of the fact that climate change is caused by human activity is quite high. So with this rising awareness, I believe the Korean news media responded actively. In the last year, the summer monsoon season was the longest ever. There were other extreme weather events that was felt seriously by the citizens. So the news media started covering these issues mostly as extreme weather events, and this slowly evolved to covering global warming and climate change, which can be actually a crisis that should be urgently tackled. And changes are also happening in politics. The government declared carbon neutrality by 2050. there are other moves followed. And these moves will be also followed by the industry. And all these events are covered by news media. So now major newspapers are all covering climate change heavily. And the economic newspapers are dealing with hydrogen economy and related issues heavily. Covering climate change myself, I believe I am at the I'm part of covering the history of the humankind. Last year, there were a lot of coverages on extreme weather events that actually show the examples of climate change in our daily lives. And this year, the coverage is more about politics regarding climate change. And I believe we need to be watching the government's policies and actions in the actions of corporations, whether ESG can lead to tangible actual changes in what the industry should be doing better to meaningfully tackle climate change. So with these perspectives, I learned that the journalists have to be aware of issues in various areas. So I believe the issue should be covered by journalists who cover a lot of various areas.
Next, I would like to invite Atikah. I'm sorry. Editor Eric Roston of Bloomberg News, please.
Hi, thank you everyone for inviting us and for attending. I have a few thoughts. I work at Bloomberg News, which is a large financial news service that is global in scope. We are in, I can't even remember how many countries, dozens and dozens. And climate change is the ultimate global story. And so Lisa and I are both lucky to work for organizations who have global footprints and are able to have reporters on the ground and able to tell this complicated story in many ways. So I thought I would talk about just a couple of things quickly. Just one is how I understand climate change to begin with. I write about science mostly. And then I'll talk a little bit about how that feeds into coverage. And then I have some thoughts on just the US media at this point. But what is climate change? What is climate, right? In the last 12,000 years, the geologists tell us that there's been this really strange and lucky period of stability in the climate. And in those 12,000 years, all of our peoples in all of the countries represented in this call and all of the many dozens of countries not represented in the call settled and built cities and had agriculture. And we did that with a firm understanding that we knew where the rivers are going to be, where the coastline ends, where it's good to grow food, and where it's not. And as incredible as it is to say this out loud even today, we can't take those things for granted anymore. And so to approach climate change journalism, you have to absorb the enormity of this topic. And you have to build an awareness of climate change into everything you write about. And that is very much part of what we do at Bloomberg with this enormous staff. We cover zinc mining, we cover agriculture, we cover things I can't even enumerate because I don't understand them. but increasingly we do it with an eye on climate change. Last January, in fact, just as COVID was, even before it was named a pandemic, we've been planning this for months. We launched a new publication called Bloomberg Green. It's available at bloomberggreen.com. And this is our home for journalism about climate change. We do every features about wine growing in Chile. We just did a big story on aging natural gas well off of the South Korean coast that is going to be an experimental carbon dioxide storage facility. So because we have staff everywhere, we can tell the story from just about anywhere. The heat wave, flooding, and all of the technological solutions that are quickly appearing and hopefully will help us eliminate our emissions. And then maybe the last thing, and like Lisa, happy to take questions. It's a very strange time in the United States. I'm sure everybody noticed. And that's a function of I think the internet in a lot of ways, and changes in media, how we all consume media. And it's both like a really great thing and a really, really terrible thing. And it's a terrible thing in that audiences are very fragmented. You don't really know who you're reaching because people are clustered in small information communities, and many of them are choosing not to access reliable information. The great thing is that we now have the ability to tell stories in many, many different ways that we never have before, with video and text and graphics. There are 3 dimensions to journalism now in a way that there never were before. And we try to do a lot with that here at Bloomberg Green, and Lisa and her colleagues at the Times do a really amazing job as well. So there's a lot of great work to do. There's a lot of great people doing great work, and always more to do.
네, 감사합니다. 그럼 이번에는 인도네시아 측
Thank you very much. Now, I invite the Singaporean panelist, Science and Environment correspondent Audrey.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Atikah, Ishmah, Winahyu.
Hello? Can you hear my voice?
네,
Yes, we hear you well.
Thank you for inviting me to this forum. It's a wonderful experience for me. I'm Atikah, journalist of Media Indonesia daily newspaper. In our media, actually, we don't have specific journalists for environment issues. So journalists in humanities division will cover environment issues as well as health and education issues. About media's role in climate change, I strongly agree with Professor Lee that media must translate technical and scientific language into an easier language. Also localize the climate change issue so people can understand what we want to deliver and make them feeling close or relate to their daily life. Because as we know, there are many terms about climate change that many people don't understand. The public doesn't give much attention to climate change issues, especially when it comes to study results. And for Professor Kelly's presentation, actually we are happy to hear that Mr. Biden's administration is returned to Paris Agreement and show his attention to climate change. We hope Mr. Biden administration could bring US to reach the target of climate policy and also can follow by another country. In Indonesia, climate change issues are still left behind. This issue is not a priority for coverage in media compared to social, economic, and political issues. It can be seen from many Indonesian online media pages that don't provide a specific menu for environment issue, just like in The Guardian. Climate change news is often related to natural disaster, collaborative activities between stakeholders, award giving, and government policies. Meanwhile, solutions for climate change problems and climate change research are often ignored. Another challenge for media in Indonesia is Indonesian people lack of interest in reading. According to UNESCO data, out of 1,000 Indonesians, only 1% is like to read. However, in 2019, Indonesia was ranked 6th in the most social countries based on the time of using social media, around 195 minutes per day. Social media become a daily necessity for people, especially young people. So I recommend news media to develop its platform, not only publish news through newspaper or website, but also using social media such as Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We can deliver information about climate change in more attractive way by complete it with pictures, graphics, or videos. Our news will reach the public, especially young people, will become the next generation. Regarding the limited news on climate change, media in Indonesia must develop it by provide special training for journalists so they will be able to write clear news about climate change and provide specific menu for environment issue in their platform. And news on climate change should not only tell about the damage reports that educate people, teach them how to protect the environment also must be a priority because with educate people how to protect environment, they will aware preventive and curative effort from anything that potential to damage the environment. So at the end, the community and press can monitor together. That's all for me. Hopefully it can be useful in the future. Thank you.
감사합니다. 그럼 마지막으로
Thank you very much. Last but not least,
기자로부터
Audrey Chan
들어보도록
of the Singaporean Straits Times.
Hi everyone, and thank you to the organizers for having me today. I'd like to get started with a brief introduction about the publication I work for and myself. So I work for the Straits Times. We are the national broadsheet of Singapore that was founded in 1845. We have bureaus all across Southeast Asia and also Greater Asia and other parts of the world, including China and the US, as well as closer to home bureaus in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. And our aim is really to explain, report not just on local events, but on how global events could affect people here in Singapore and also the region. So maybe I'll just give you guys a bit of an idea about the kind of audiences that we are reaching here in Singapore. So earlier we heard about, science denialism in the US, but I guess in Singapore, our audience, there's not so much denialism. It's more of apathy. So our communication strategies tries to contextualize global events for our local audiences to try to give them an idea about why we should care about this existential crisis. So the Straits Times covers climate change news in a variety of ways. One of them is to let our audience know why global events matter to them. So for example, the IPCC, the UN climate science body, they have recently released a large slew of reports. What we aim to do is we not only just report on what the UN says, what the IPCC says, but also try to find stories that would resonate with our local audience. So as an example, the IPCC in 2019, they issued a report on land use change and how that links to climate. One local story that we did to try to make this important to our readers was how the deforestation and habitat loss can actually affect important pollinators for durians. So I'm not sure whether all of you know what that is, but it's a tropical fruit that may smell very pungent to those who are not accustomed to it, but it's considered a great delicacy here in Southeast Asia. So that's one way we try to contextualize global reports like these. Another thing we try to do is to make climate impacts more accessible. Earlier we heard about Lisa's experience with hurricane reporting in the US. In Singapore, we are a really small country, and if you look at our geography, we are kind of surrounded by other large land masses. So in a way, we are kind of cushioned from the harshest impacts of climate change. Although sea level rise is an issue for us, and rising temperatures we do not have the same kind of large natural disasters or climate-induced disasters that other countries face. So we try to make the gravity of the problem clear to our audiences by trying new kinds of communication techniques. For instance, we use El Nino, so that's a climate phenomenon that has a huge impact on Southeast Asia, as an analog to explain the impacts of long-term climate change. During El Nino event here in Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, we get a lot hotter, drier weather and forest fires, which are quite typical of the landscape in the agroforestry sector in this region. It burn harder and for longer. That causes huge episodes of transboundary haze, which our audience in Singapore can feel. So we try to use these kind of strategies to try to make climate impacts relatable, accessible, and to highlight the scale of the problem. Earlier, Professor Lee also talked about the importance of using new media, and that's something we also try to do here. Even though we have a print legacy, we are experimenting with new strategies like podcasts, videos, and actually other publications around the world are huge, provide lots of print spoke for us. The New York Times is definitely one. I'm a great fan of all the interactive graphics that they do. Closer to home, there are also publications like Rage in Malaysia that really do great graphics that simplify or make technical terms and explanations something that's easier for people with no background to understand. That being said, we do try to improve climate communication here, but it's still a work in progress, and we're also learning. So it's great that you guys have convened this forum so we can learn from other journalists. One big issue I face in SC or in Singapore is having time. It's great to hear that the New York Times has such a large climate desk just devoted to covering climate news. At the Straits Times, I'm one of the reporters, along with our climate change editor, Ms. David Fogarty. He was from Reuters. It's huge experience covering climate issues, but it's mainly just the two of us now. And I'm also a science reporter, so I have been thrust into the thick of COVID-19 science reporting. So time spent on climate change, it's a zero-sum game every time. So that's one challenge. Another one is avoiding the doom and gloom narrative. So Bloomberg Green is also a great example for us. We do try to provide solutions, journalism, instead of just reporting on the problem. Yes. And another issue we face, which actually, Eric, I wanted to ask you about, is how do you guys avoid greenwashing, especially for business news? So I think one thing that we are facing criticism for is that ST's coverage of climate change is not consistent, because sometimes in the news stories that David and I write, we write about the problem, the role of banks in financing fossil fuels and stuff like that. But on the other hand, when there's business coverage of those banks, whenever they have like new initiatives like green loans, the reporting is less, the climate link is less clear. So I'm really curious how you guys strike this balance. I guess I'll end off with that question. Thank you.
It's a great question. It's a really important question, and it's really hard. And like I've written about this a lot, and I have colleagues who have, and like even though we've written about it a lot, like every few months, every year, like we still are constantly asking analysts and other people, investors, how do we know if companies are telling the truth or not, or if their goals are real or not? And there is a list, like there's actually, I've written about this, there's a list of maybe, I can't remember, like a half a dozen or 10 things that when a company makes a statement, you can look at their goals and say, okay, well, are they working with this organization called the Science-Based Targets Initiative? Like if you Google Science-Based Targets Initiative, that is a leading organization. It's a project by a group of nonprofits, and they work with companies to help them set goals that are in line with science. Another thing is like, what is the baseline that a company is saying that they're using as their yardstick, or I'm sorry, they're like, you know, their metric for gauging their progress. Like if they're saying, well, we're going to reduce our emissions, you know, 20% below 2020 levels, that's much, much weaker than we're going to reduce our emissions 20% below 1990 levels. And Kelly had a really great explanation of this in her talk. So I'll send a note to the organizers of the event here with that and some other links. But you've really identified a question that even people who write about this a lot are constantly trying to figure out how we can have better answers to that question. But there are answers. So.
I would just add on. Sorry. No, I would just add on to that also, you know, I mean, we also struggle with that same question all the time. You could spend your whole career writing about, you know, every company that has an announcement, right, on what they're doing. But one of the things that we started to look at a lot was comparing what companies are saying and even what companies are doing on the ground, you know, within the four walls of their companies or their supply chain, and where they're giving their lobbying dollars. And I don't know how transparent lobbying, you know, reports are, Audrey, in Singapore or in Indonesia, but you know, in the United States, you will find still a number of countries that, and pardon me, a number of companies that have sometimes very aggressive, you know, internal emissions reduction goals, but continue to contribute to the campaigns of members of Congress who fight climate change legislation. Or even, you know, at minimum, this is not something that they're lobbying on, right? You know, companies tend to put their lobbying dollars into issues like taxes or trade, you know, and healthcare legislation. They might have really great commitments on climate change, but they're not out there using their lobbying muscle for the most part to try and turn that into real legislation, real lasting legislation in Congress where we are.
Another really helpful organization, just quickly, there's an organization in the UK called Influence Map. So influencemap.org, and they do a lot of research on what Lisa was just talking about.
되게 열정적으로
Thank you so
바로
much.
토론 이야기를 계속 펼쳐주셨는데요.
Thank you for your heated discussions. With regard to the questions that have been raised, let us now invite our presenters to provide their responses and feedback, after which we will open the floor to discussions. Professor Tae-dong Lee, would you like to comment on or comment on the questions? A lot of the journalists working in the field will probably know better about this, but preventing greenwashing is a very pivotal role of the media for sure. If such measures exist and if they are systematic, then it would be very important. Having said that, I also think that it would be important to encourage what companies do well, such as ESG. Whether that is greenwashing or not, there should be the right kind of guidelines in place so that companies, private sector, civic groups, and the academia can have a better understanding of how each actor is responding to climate change.
그럼 이번에는 켈리
Next,
심스 학자님께서 방금
Dean Kelly Sims Gallagher,
한번 의견
if you have anything to add to the discussions, please.
Thank you very much. No, I don't have anything to add.
알겠습니다. 그럼 혹시 발표 내용과 토론 내용 관련해서
With regard to,
먼저 플로어 질문 먼저
let us now open the floor for questions. Anyone from the floor?
없으신 것 같은데요.
If not,
열띤 토론을 들으면서 저도
while listening to the very active and heated discussions. Oh yes, please.
네, 저는 질문 드릴 것이 좀 몇 가지 많이
I do have a couple of questions for all of you. Due to the COVID-19 situation, climate change journalists were not able to visit other countries for their climate change news coverage. So I would like to thank you for today's opportunity, and I have quite a few number of questions. Experts from the United States and journalists from the United States, I heard the comment that climate change has become politicized, and I very much agree to that. With regard to renewable energies and nuclear power plants in Korea, there is much heated debate and controversy over these issues, and I also see signs of these topics being politicized. In the U.S., my question is, how do you view and cover power plant-related issues? That is, nuclear power plant-related issues. We're talking about carbon neutrality, the U.S. government did. And I think the EU also has goals for nuclear power plants. So please respond to that. That was a question to the U.S. side. Next, to the Indonesian reporter, I have a question for you too. The Jawa coal issue is of interest to Korea. Korean capital, whether it should go into coal development or not, and whether we should decarbonize more, are topics that are being discussed quite actively. So my question is, how much consensus is there in Indonesia on the topic of coal development or on topics related to renewable energy? So that was to Indonesia. And next, to the New York Times journalists. You talked about how you have a climate change desk. You are probably the only one in the world to have such a desk. So, do you have an editor-in-chief within your desk? How much decision-making power does that person have? Because we have team leaders and directors within our teams. With regard to environmental literacy, I very much agree to what you have all commented on. YouTube, podcasts, and various platforms are being used to create articles. Nevertheless, covering climate change is not an easy thing. So, I think information delivery is a very important role. Do you agree that the news media should play the role of information delivery actively? Any comments on this, please, to all of you? Thank you. I apologize for raising too many questions.
그러면은 이제 먼저 아까 질문 주신 인도네시아
Right. Maybe answers from Indonesia be much appreciated. Can you be brief?
너무 시간 관계상 어려우시면
Sorry, I can hear clearly what she asked before because the translation is not complete enough.
통역이 잘 안 들려서 그러면 다시 한번 질문을 짧게 다시 한번 질문.
Can you repeat your question briefly? All right. So there is the coal-fired power plant issue in Indonesia. So what's the public opinion there in Indonesia? Because it's related to Korean capital investing in coal-fired power plants in Indonesia. When the government is suspending investment in coal-fired power plants domestically, but allowing Korean capital to invest in coal-fired power plant in Indonesia.
안 들리시면 제가 따로 메일을 드리도록 하겠습니다.
Well, if you still cannot hear the interpretation, I'm going to send you an email.
전달이 됐을지 모르겠는데.
You can. I didn't really hear about that. I'm sorry because right now I'm covering international issue than the local issue, especially the local environment issues.
Maybe I could take
그러면
nuclear.
혹시 그럼 이번엔 아까 그 블룸버그 아니죠. 뉴욕타임즈 기자님께
Right. Then maybe
관련한 데스크가 어떤
we can
형태를 말하는
hear
건지
some
주셨는데요.
answers from Lisa Friedman of New York Times about the status or rank of the climate desk.
Sure. Let me just take the nuclear question very briefly because I think it's a really interesting issue. I know it's a hot topic in Korea. The debate in the United States, I think, is equally interesting. You know, in the United States, you have many environmental groups who are deeply concerned about nuclear energy, about continuing to support aging nuclear plants, about building new plants. You know, of course, the climate change concern is that as aging nuclear plants, as they retire, what are they replaced with? Often natural gas, which you know, which while it doesn't have as high carbon emissions rates as coal, still is heavily polluting. You know, I think the question was, how do we cover it? We cover it like we cover everything, straightforwardly. And, you know, we try to help people understand the concerns that environmental groups have, and many Democrats, and the concerns about the climate and where industry is. One area in the United States where you're going to see this debate play out in the next few months is around the clean electricity standard. The Biden administration has said that it wants to pass a national clean energy standard in the United States as part of an infrastructure package. What clean means, whether nuclear will be part of that, whether CCS, carbon capture and storage for gas will be part of that, will be a huge debate. And just to answer your question about the climate desk, yes. So the editor-in-chief of the New York Times is Dean Baquet. We have an editor on the climate team, Hannah Fairfield, and deputy editors as well. And the way we come up with stories is really a collaboration. We meet at least once a week to discuss stories. I have a direct editor that I talk about stories with all the time. Tomorrow, for example, President Moon is in town. Climate change will be on the agenda. I recently did a story about the United States' urging Korea to take far more aggressive steps than it's already agreed to really increase its 2030 target So that's really an ongoing collaboration, as I assume it is with Eric and Audrey and Saitasal and all of the journalists here.
혹시 충분한 답변이 되셨는지 세율이 네. 답변해 주시면
So, does it answer your question?
감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
네.
Thank you very much for your answers.
혹시 하실 말씀
Oh, Professor Lee, anything to add? No? Okay.
그러면 다른 의견 있으신 분들 있으실지 여쭤보고
If there are any final questions, or if not, I think we have reached the end of this morning's forum.
원자력 발전에서 정치적인
Oh, the nuclear power plant and that issue being politicized. Yes, I think there was response to that.
그러면은 이제 열띤 토론을 이제
Thank you very
마무리를
much
해보도록
for
하겠습니다.
the heated discussions.
굉장히 의미 있는 시간이었고요. 언론인으로서
We had a very meaningful forum
인데
indeed because as a journalist myself, I think we deepened our understanding about how we can cover climate change issues and how we can discuss this issue and share relevant information. With this, we would like to conclude this morning's EWC-KPF forum. Thank you all for taking part, both online and offline.
지금 아직 방송되고 있는 거죠? 오늘 잠시 안내 말씀드리겠습니다. 오늘 한국 시간으로 오후 4시 30분에 한유럽 언론 합동 토론회가 또 열립니다. 기후변화 대응과
So at 4:30 p.m. Korean time, we have another forum between Korean and European journalists.
언론진흥재단과 아리랑 TV 유튜브 채널에서
It is going to be also live stream on YouTube
수고 많으셨습니다. 감사합니다.
and Arirang TV. Please join us in the afternoon as well. Thank you very much.